I want to thank the, we want to thank the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy and our guest speaker, Luvia, for this opportunity to present a perspective that, on immigration that you don't typically see on the news today. So this is something a little bit different, and I think it'll give you some information. Our speaker is Luvia Quinones. She serves as the Health Policy Director at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, which is shortened to ICIRR. In this role, she oversees the in-person counselor program, the Immigrant Healthcare Access Initiative, and in collaboration with ICIRR's members, develops ICIRR's health policy agenda and a special focus in access to healthcare and on healthcare reform. Prior to joining ICIRR, she worked at the City Colleges of Chicago under the Communications Relations Department. She played an integral part in creating and launching a new department. Prior to that, she oversaw the first state-funded citizenship program here in Illinois at ICIRR. It's called the New Americans Initiative. Luvia has a master's in public policy from the University of Colorado, I'm from Colorado, excuse me, University of Chicago, and I just moved you. Yes, U of C, which is also Colorado, and a BA in International Studies from DePaul University. She is the daughter of Mexican immigrants from Durango, Mexico, and is an active community member in her parish. Currently, she serves on the board of the Western Suburban Action Project and the Illinois Association of Free and Charitable Clinics. Please welcome Luvia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I always like to start off, before I talk to you about the organization, a few kind of warnings per se. I talk a little fast, and I always tell people that good thing I'm talking in English today, because in Spanish I talk a little faster. So if for some reason you can't hear me or you want me to repeat something, I want this to be informal, interactive, and I really want to make sure that everybody walks away with learning something. So feel free. Nobody's going to get offended if you tell me I didn't hear you or you said something too fast. Secondly, one of the things I always like to do in my presentations is I really want to make sure that the audience actually gets a little bit of why you came today. It is a Sunday afternoon, so there's no reason why you had to come today. So I thought we would make it a little informal, and I want to know who's in the room. So if you want to say briefly your name, and then maybe one thing that you would like to learn or hear today, just to make sure that I cover as much as I can in my talk today. So we'll start over here. Great. Well, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I will say that during today's talk, I was not planning on talking about health policy, even though that is what I do as my role at ICIRR, but I'm happy to go into it. One thing that I might allude to in my talk is this thing called public charge. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, kind of what is causing some of the fear and the anxiety in the community. For those of you that are involved with ACES, which is one of our member organizations of ICIRR, a large number of immigrant families are choosing not to enroll in Medicaid, let alone a bunch of other services. So I'm happy to go into that. And I think with that, I'll say that even though I do have this presentation, I'm happy to go off topic because I know that there is a lot of interest in how to get involved, what you could do either personally or for those of you that are involved with different organizations with different boards. So feel free to tell me I want to talk a little bit more about this or that. I'm pretty flexible about that, okay? So with that, I'll start off first by sharing a little bit about who we are as an organization, and then I'll go into the presentation. I don't want to assume everybody knows what or who ICIRR is. So the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ICIRR, has been around for I think about 35 years or so. We were created shortly after the last amnesty or the last legalization. So shortly after 1986, I think we were founded in 1988, 1989 roughly, and we were created as a direct result of trying to answer what we were going to do as Illinois for those individuals that were not able to get a green card with the 1986. So we've been around for a while. There has been different, you could say, format structures to the organization, but ultimately the priorities, how I like to explain them, is kind of two different pillars. So what the one pillar is, we do capacity building, and we do a lot of trainings and presentations. And by capacity building, I mean some of the state-funded programs that we administer and oversee, like the citizenship program. We have another program that helps individuals navigate health and human services with a specific focus on limited English proficient individuals. So the one pillar is the capacity building and the trainings presentations. The other pillar, and again, this is just how I like to describe the work that we do, the other pillar being the advocacy, policy, and community organizing. So what the easiest way to explain that is, how many of you are familiar with the driver's license that individuals that are undocumented are able to obtain? Okay, that was about a 13 to 15 year campaign. It took a really, really long time, and that was a direct result of our member organizations, which included healthcare providers, labor unions, community organizations, just to name a few. There was a lot of people involved, really wanted to make sure that they were coming together with the same goal, which was for anybody that lived here to be able to obtain a driver's license. Obviously, there are certain restrictions within that you need to have certain identifications to be able to obtain it. But prior to that, it was very difficult, and we all know that individuals need to go to work, need to go to school, and in some places, including unfortunately in Lake County and DuPage, sometimes there was a person that wouldn't have a driver's license, and they would get pulled over for a traffic violation, and then all of a sudden they would go from a traffic violation to getting deported. So now with having a driver's license, not only do we all know who's on the road, but they're also able to obtain car insurance, let alone avoid getting deported. So that's just one example in regards to how our advocacy, policy, and community organizing works. Any comments or questions so far on that? Okay, so that was really briefly who we are as ICIRR. There's a lot more that we do, including some of our health policy, but I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the trip that we took a few months ago. So the main reason we took how the idea of the trip came about was one of our member organizations, Arab American Family Services, out in Bridgeview, started talking to me about how within the Arab community, there was a lot of similarities within the Latino immigrants and how both communities were not aware of those. So as we're having these conversations, keep in mind that I've known these women for almost 15 years. So it was a very informal conversation. They threw out this idea, how about if we take some of our community leaders, some of our community members within the Arab community down to the southern border to expose them of the issues and bring back that experience back to Illinois to really build those bridges. Even though within the Arab, African, you name it, whatever immigrant community, there's a lot of similarities, sometimes between either racism or sometimes between cultural differences. The communities don't always talk to each other. And sometimes it could be as simple as because of language barriers. So one of the things that they were really interested in, just how there is the wall between Palestine and Israel, this wall that has now been created, or has been, you could say for a while, between Mexico and the US. So that's how the conversation started. It originally started with that focus, and then we ended up expanding it to other members within ICIRR, including Latino, Asian, and a few others. So just a quick background there. So those are some of the organizations that ended up going. We started with a way longer list. I think it was about 20 organizations that were originally interested, but sometimes between scheduling as well as financial reasons, they were not able to go. So you'll see that it's pretty diverse, even some academics, as well as immigration attorneys that ended up going with us as well. So just to give you a perspective of where we went, we ended up going both between San Diego and Tijuana. Just in case people are asking about the Texas border, at the time when we were choosing which border to go to, we were hearing about a lot more issues, specifically around violence and security issues in the Texas border, and we just didn't want to risk there being issues, especially because some of the people that were going do wear hijabs. So the last thing we wanted was for there to be any issues specifically for certain people that were there. So that's why we ended up choosing Tijuana. And the other reason, it ended up being some of the conversations and partnerships we established were a lot quicker within the San Diego area versus in Texas. Probably because some of the organizations in Texas have just been in constant attack as well as just working a lot. So just a quick explanation there. So we started our trip. We ended up being there for about 4 days. We started it with the American Foreign Service Committee. It's an international organization. They've been around for a really long time, mainly because the individuals that went on the trip wanted to get both the big picture of what was going on policy-wise, as well as a little bit of the history between that border in Tijuana before we went into the direct service organizations, which are the organizations that you'll hear about in a second, of the ones that are actually working directly on a daily basis with migrants and refugees. There is some information there in case you want to either donate, etc. for that. Okay, then the next one, this one ended up being a really interesting conversation with Colectivo Zapatista and the Palestinian youth movement. These are more radical and more leftist organizations. So we wanted to make sure that the individuals that were going had both perspectives. Sometimes depending what organization you visit or you partner with, you would only get one side of the story. So we really wanted to make sure that we were exposing the members or the individuals broadly speaking. The individual here, he's involved directly with the Colectivo Zapatista, and right now they are working in the San Diego area around housing issues as well as gentrification. You'll see from the mural in the back, it kind of gives the history, a little bit of Mexican Revolution, etc. So that part of the conversation tour was kind of how that park has been used to maintain some of the family and cultural traditions within the Latino community, and how it's also been used by newly arrived migrants to feel comfortable, given depending where you are in San Diego, individuals, especially if you're monolingual in Spanish or other languages, because people that are coming from Central America speak other languages, how some of them have been feeling more comfortable within that area. We had a community dialogue at the Migrant Center, I think that's how it's pronounced. That is by the Palestinian youth movement. And that conversation, and I'm not here to talk politics between Israel and Palestine, so that's not what I want to get into. But that conversation with this group ended up being very, very educational, as they were sharing with us some of the issues that the Palestinian community have with the increased migrants coming from Central America, and how there's just been overall increased repercussions across all immigrant communities. And the other interesting point of that was when they were sharing with us that the same company that was hired to build the southern border is the same company that was used to build the wall between Palestine and Israel. So again, I'm not here to go into politics, that was one information that I found really interesting, of just the similarities, where it's completely different continent, completely different politics, but yet we're finding ourselves kind of that similarity. The other thing also is, one of the things that the center is trying to do is build bridges between the Palestinian, the Arab community, and the Latino community. And even though there are a lot of similarities, again, sometimes because of the cultural differences or simply just not being familiar with the communities, the difficulties that they've been having. So they've been having to start very, very basic. We're simply just doing introductions within the community, specifically focusing on some of the leaders within the community, whether it be maybe some of the pastors or preachers, etc., in the Latino community, and some of the other leaders from either mosque or other within the Arab community, and then trying to start there within the community. So it was really interesting to hear just some of the challenges, all with the same goal of trying to build these bridges and increase communication between the communities. Quick pause if there's any questions or clarification points so far. There's some information about the center. Okay, So one of the things that we wanted to do also is not only it to be educational, the trip, as well as learning, but also actually do something. For those of us that are advocates, we could only learn so much without doing something. So after receiving training from the American Service Committee, we also went out right along the border and actually did Know Your Rights. That's something for those of you that don't know, we as an organization as ICIRR also do. So we do a lot of trainings in the community for individuals that want to, one, learn about rights for everyone, and then two, be able to then go out in your own community and do the same thing. So those little green cards that you got out, that's how we start the conversation on Know Your Rights. But just know that there's those trainings available and presentations called Know Your Rights. And we do them for immigration overall, but I also do them around healthcare, given that a lot of individuals don't know what their rights are when they go to a hospital or something. So going back to this is just when we're kind of like learning how to go about it. This you'll see on the left-hand side, left-hand side I think, the border. It has been strengthened, increased. You'll see from the bottom, there's one wall, then there's the other one. On the other side, the right-hand side, are some of the individuals that went with us. And we were literally just out there in different points of the border. On the US side, passing out documents that explain people's rights, and also sharing with them if they did have any issues crossing the border where they could report them, assuming that they wanted to. The Tijuana border, similar to the one in El Paso in Texas, are crossed by high numbers by individuals that go back and forth a lot. So some of the individuals we came across had just live in Mexico, but were just coming to the US side to work. Sometimes they also go back and forth a lot, either for school or sometimes to help individuals being nannies, babysitters, etc. So a good number of people that we came across were like, no, I'm good, I live in Mexico, I don't need to know that. But the American Friends Service Committee, which we were working with to do this, AFSP, wanted to know if there was an increase in issues or barriers crossing the border. We have been hearing about some violations of people's rights, of just more questioning, interviews lasting a lot longer. Even individuals that do have a green card or are naturalized citizens, sometimes being pulled aside for more questioning. And unfortunately, depending on if they were dark-skinned versus light-skinned, just more questions. So that was one of the things that we wanted to get out of that. I think you had a question, ma'am?
Yeah, I was not familiar that there were people who came and went.
Yes.
So what type of paperwork do they need? Do they need a visa to work?
Sure. So the question, in case not everybody heard it, was she said that she wasn't familiar that people went back and forth a lot between the border, and then the question was what paperwork is needed. So individuals that are going back and forth, for the most part, are legal permanent residents, so they have a green card. Yes, so they have a green card, or they're naturalized citizens. People that have visas, it would be challenging for them to go back and forth a lot for a couple of reasons. One, because if you have a visa, technically you got it to stay in the US. So therefore, going back and forth on a daily basis in the last 2 years has been increasing difficult just because you get questioned a lot more. I myself have witnessed individuals that have a student visa of some of the times that I've traveled, and the immigration officer pulls a person aside and asks them, you just traveled 3 months ago, why are you traveling again? So therefore, I would doubt it that the people that are going back and forth on a daily basis have some kind of visa. And again, it's mainly because of work. It's mainly because on the US side, it's just a lot more expensive to live. And then also groceries and stuff. So a lot of people live on the Mexico side, but then come over to work on the US side. So that's one of the reasons. I see you puzzled. Do you have a question?
With a green card, I thought you had to live in the United States.
You do. You are able to stay out of the country maximum 6 months. So most of these people, I'm assuming they're gonna have a house or they're gonna have something to show that they live in the US. but they do need to they do need to be the majority of the time in the U.S. Yes?
So where is their passport?
Excuse me?
Is their passport Mexico?
For people that are legal permanent residents, they need to have a passport from their home country. They're not able to only have a green card. I will say that when you're crossing the border by land, sometimes they just ask you for the green card, but if you're traveling by air, you do need to have both. You need to have your passport from your country, home country, and your green card. Yes?
Does this work though? Because I know we heard about the U.S. citizen recently who was held for a while, even though he was carrying his ID. So regardless of ID, is it actually working for those people, or are they scared also?
I could say that it's changed, so I don't know personally, but I mean, I could tell you that it does work because we saw people going back and forth a lot, and we even walked on the bridge that goes from the U.S. to the Mexico side. On the other end, that's where you have the trains and you have the buses. So we did see people going back and forth, and we saw a good number of people actually bringing different items from Mexico, whether it be things that were cheaper. I can't say exactly what because they were carrying little carts. But I can say that starting last January, there has been an increase in fear and anxiety about what you're saying, of how much, am I going to be questioned a lot more, and am I going to have to carry extra documentation? I say specifically January, and I'll connect it to my earlier comment around public charge, is last January, the federal administration decided to do some changes on this thing called the Foreign Affairs Manual. It's a book manual that every consular office immigration official has to review and has to use as he or she is making a decision on whether or not to admit somebody with the visa, whether it be a tourist, a student, whatever it is. That manual said that they need, as they're doing interviews for these individuals, they need to assess, the immigration official needs to assess how likely this individual that's trying to obtain a visa will use some kind of government benefit. You may be wondering how. So this immigration officer has the power to look into the future, literally, and based on your language, based on your education level, based on your health, based on how many dependents you have, and based on what you have in your home country, that's how the officer will decide whether or not to grant you the visa. So that's been going on for over a year. So as a result of that, data shows that there's been a decrease in visas being approved. Even people that have strong connections to their home country because they're older maybe, or because maybe they have diabetes, they have some kind of chronic illness, then the officers deny the opportunity for them to come and visit their relatives. So I'm connecting all that because on the one hand, people are afraid as they're crossing. On the other hand, you are seeing less people apply for visas because they know that there's that issue.
So the presumption underlying that is if someone from another country is likely to need help when they get here, we don't want them and they're not entitled to be here.
Correct. And it has always been the case that there is an interview, there is a whole health examination process where a person has to go to. That has always been the case. The scary part is now that the immigration officer has the power and the authority to predict anytime in the future. So imagine if you're, I don't know, hypothetically, imagine if you're 50 years old. You could still work, right? 50, you could work another 10, 15 years. But if this officer wants to say, because you're 50 and because you only went up to high school, for example, you only went up to 6th grade, that officer is not able to say, well, if you actually give you this visa, maybe eventually you're just going to stay in the U.S. That's what's scary, just that ability and that power for these individuals not to be able to predict.
Yeah, it's become subjective.
Yeah, so that happened over a year ago. I'll connect it to what's happening, unfortunately, now, even within the U.S., this is what's happening abroad. So anyways, that just goes a little bit into your question, ma'am. Yes?
The people who go back and forth,
Uh-huh.
how long does it take them to cross the border these days?
It varies depending the border And it varies also sometimes what documentation the person has. And unfortunately, it also varies depending on the immigration officer. So it's hard to answer the question because there's just a lot of different variables. Really subjective. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of people think it's only happening to the Hispanic countries, but I have a couple of friends who stayed here, they went to school here, and they were staying after their visa, they need a student visa, and they contacted lawyers, immigration lawyers, and they were both just last year sent back to Germany. So it isn't just happening
Yes.
to the Hispanic countries,
Yes.
it's happening. And they've tried everything, going to all kinds of immigration lawyers. One was doing pro bono for them, and no matter what they did, they were still sent back.
Yeah, I mean, things unfortunately have gotten stricter and worse overall for everyone that is not a U.S. citizen. And even then, how you alluded to, there was this child, I think he was 13 or 14.
American citizen.
16, yeah, or 16, yeah, where he was detained for 3 days, I think it was. It was a few days. Excuse me?
I think it was more than
It was more, okay. I know it was a few days. I know that he lost weight, and he was a U.S. citizen, despite also him carrying identification. Yes. So things are getting worse, unfortunately, and the overall enforcement that's happening is pretty bad for everyone. And you're correct, it's not only for Latinos, it's for overall everyone. So another organization that we visited and we had a really good discussion was with the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium. They're a little similar to ICIRR, but with a specific focus on the border. It is a coalition of different organizations representing both Latino, African, and other refugee communities within San Diego. And they have been not only making sure that people know their rights, as it relates to when they are getting close to the border or simply just in case it gets stopped by police, etc., but also creating different programs and initiatives for them to receive the necessary services. So they're also doing great work down there. And that's some more information. And I believe the gentleman told me that you guys are going to be, the PowerPoint's going to be shared with everyone, right? So don't worry about having to keep track of all the websites. So this was the actual visit to the border. The person talking to us is the one that works at the American Friends Service Committee, Pedro Rios. And the picture over here on the right, that is the entrance and the exit that literally separates one of the parts or one of the sections between Mexico and the US. And you can't see it from here, but going a good mile or so from those doors, that is where a significant number of migrants that you hear about in the news are trying to get in line. So that's literally where we were, where these individuals that are coming from Central America are trying to get in line, per se, to be able to get then examined as well as be able to prove their case for why they're trying to seek asylum in the US. One of the things that we heard, which was really disheartening, is prior to this administration, well, not only were individuals not coming in large numbers, but there was a process for them to either get a number per se and then be able to get an interview, etc. Right now, the moment they know that you're a migrant, not only are you pushed back to Mexico, but it's very, very much near impossible for you to actually get in line or form in line to be able to then try to talk to an officer. And then just the dynamics between the officers that are asked and told to go and look for the next person that's supposed to be in line, and just the treatment that we heard with some of those officers of how they talk to these individuals was very disheartening. And what they've been trying to do is, on the Mexico side, the migrants have been trying to organize themselves on a volunteer basis, where as individuals are coming to Mexico, just creating a list. So they have a list themselves, where as individuals are coming to Mexico, they just start writing their names, and that's how they decide among themselves who's going next to talk to an immigration officer. So that part was really interesting, and it really showed the power and the empowerment among themselves. How yes, it's difficult, but they're trying to really, as much as they can, be organized to avoid chaos and more, you could say, dysfunction across that process. Yes?
I was just reading yesterday that with this return to Mexico policy, that where the majority of them are being sent back to Mexico and they're given a date to show up, and often it's the wrong date, and there's that problem. But when they try and contact someone in the U.S. to obtain legal representation, they're told it's almost impossible. Is that
Correct.
because of logistics?
It's mainly because of how our system is. So I'm trying to remember what branch of government, and I'm blanking out right now. But you know how, like, all of us know that if we get detained in the scenario that we're U.S. citizens, we have a right to an attorney, right? Pro bono, whatever. When it comes to immigration matters, that is not the case. There's no such thing as if you say you are undocumented in the U.S., you do not have right to an attorney for purposes of immigration. So that's one of the reasons. There's lack of resources, and the system in place is just not set up to really help those individuals. That's why you hear of attorneys going to the border on a pro bono basis, trying to help navigate individuals of just what kind of paperwork they need, let alone where do they go.
Right, and I think the bottom line is they said that the people that are pushed back to Mexico, when they come, there's less than like 0.2% have legal representation. Whereas
Yes.
the people on this side before, when they were allowed to stay here and given a number.
Because they get connected to an
37%
organization.
or
Yes.
something. So
Yeah.
it's just, so the point of the policy is,
Yeah, and
those
also.
people are never going to win.
Correct. And not only that, but I would also say that the other difficulty, both that we heard on this trip and overall what we've been hearing in the news and just from our member organizations, is things continue to change every day. So one day, individuals that are trying to seek asylum are told, you need X, Y, and Z. The next day, they're like, no, you need this. And then the other thing is, because these individuals don't have a permanent address in Mexico or wherever else nearby, sometimes their notices to appear get sent to random places. Sometimes they also get sent incorrect date or times. So when they do appear, they don't know where. And the other thing is, unfortunately, the issues that they've experienced within Mexico. As a Mexican, I'll say that they have been very racist against these individuals. Not only not wanting to assist them, but also really pushing them out from any kind of assistance. So unfortunately, there's that issue too. Yes?
Are these things happening to everyone trying to cross the border, or only to those who are seeking asylum?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think how to distinguish it, because I could say that some of these things have been happening for a long time. So for those coming, I'll answer the question based on some of the countries. So for example, from people that are coming from Central America, whether it be Guatemala, Honduras, etc., because there's those political and financial dynamics between those countries and Mexico, there is increased enforcement as well as racism between them. Also because, unfortunately, what the media has portrayed as individuals coming from those countries are affiliated with gangs, etc. So there's this notion of some of these individuals are criminals. So then, therefore, when they do come to Mexico, Mexicans treat them worse, let alone don't help them. On the other hand, if you're asking in regards to Mexicans that are trying to cross the border, that's always been hard and difficult. And many people, till this day, continue to die at the border trying to cross, whether it be the river. And there's been a lot of stories of both migrants and individuals that are Mexicans just dying either with the heat in the desert or the river. So the treatment, I would say it's bad overall, but there's just that extra level if you're from Central America specifically. There's just a little bit worse treatment because you're not in your country. If that answers the question.
It does. I was trying to process how American immigration law and standards link to other countries. And, I have minimal travel experience, but when I go to another country, they ask if I'm there to visit or if I'm there for an extended stay, where I'm going to be. So I'm trying to understand the kinds of questions that are asked and whether detention or being held without being able to access an attorney, does that link to standard questions? Is there a process?
Not at all. No, not at all. It's all subjective, and it's very different. I could tell you from personal experience, I was born here, so I do have the privilege of traveling with the U.S. passport. A few years ago when I traveled with somebody, he looked, even though he was Mexican, he looked Arab. The questions he got asked, and he was born in the U.S., were very different than the questions I got asked. And I know I'm light-skinned, and I know that for some people I don't look Mexican, which I won't go into that conversation. So I could say that the questions are definitely subjective, and unfortunately, over time, under this administration, I'm trying not to be partisan, but under this administration, immigration officials have had more and more power and more authority. And because how immigration law is written, that if you're trying to come to the U.S. because you're a visitor, you are allowing, according to immigration law, you are subject to more questioning because you are visiting the U.S. Yes?
When people are sent back, where do they literally go? Are there camps? Are there settlements? Where do they go when they're sent back?
It depends who you're referencing. If you're talking about individuals that get deported, or individuals that are denied asylum.
Who are going to the border and then are rejected at the border, and you say they're sent back?
Yes. So, depending the day and depending when because up until recently, a good number of them would still stay on the border, on the Mexico side, and they would go either to a refugee organization, a settlement organization, etc., which I'll get into in a little bit. We visited 2 of them. Some of them, because of the increased enforcement within Mexico, are being forced to their home country. So it varies. Unfortunately, both Guatemala and Mexico have come into an agreement, a legal agreement with the U.S., where they do come across an individual that's seeking asylum and is denied asylum. There is now a partnership and communication between these countries to then send them back to the home country. So it depends where they're caught and stuff. Yes?
Yes, can you tell me, how does Canada or other countries handle immigration?
I don't know Canadian government or immigration that much, but I can tell you from my personal experience. Give me a second. I'll tell you from my own experience. I actually traveled with my family there about 8 years ago, and we had not gone to Canada, even though it's so close, because at the time, my brother-in-law was undocumented. So we waited until he got his green card. I've driven both to Mexico as well as to Canada. And I'm not exaggerating. Going into Canada, both entering and exiting, took 5 minutes maybe, literally. And they didn't even ask us to get off the car. And we had a van and we had a car. They just collected our passports, they looked at our passports, and they let us through, both times. When you go to Mexico, not at all. You have to get off the car, they have to inspect your car, they need to bring dogs to smell your cars, and they ask you 1,000,001 questions. And depending how much stuff you have with you, sometimes there is, unfortunately, the bribing of the immigration officers to allow you to take some stuff to your family back in Mexico. So very different.
You said going into Mexico. Is that Mexican officials or American?
Both. The bribery in Mexico, but in regards to the enforcement and the strictness, both. Yes.
So I live in Canada.
Okay.
On a student visa. And so I can tell you that when you apply, there's, depending on it's very provincial, but right now there's different relationships depending on where you're applying from. So there's certain countries that, for example, the United States,
Could they prefer?
Western Europe countries, it's super easy. Literally show up at the border and are like, hi, I want whatever your work permit is. And there's certain papers you have to fill out, you get kind of pre-approved, but it's super easy. But I have friends who are from, like, maybe are from Central America, Latin America, or like basically a non-white country. It's a lot harder, and you have to apply, like it takes 3 to 6 months at least. And depending on the province, though, there's actually the same rise in xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. So you're seeing, for example, in Quebec, there's now actually a Quebec values test that is required to be administered after 2 years of living in Quebec. And if you don't pass it, you're not allowed to remain in the province of Quebec. And so it also just, there's huge, so a lot of these issues applying at the border and a lot of immigration issues on the border in Canada is a lot easier if you're American, but also it's becoming overall harder. And there's also the fact that there is a rise in people who are looking to seek asylum in Canada. So you're seeing a lot of this pressure to send people back and to not allow people into Canada because of that. And for the question about the, if you're going to basically discussions you're having with immigration, because I wasn't born in the US, I get a lot more very derogatory questions or questioning of my reasonings for going across the border coming in from Canada, even though I have a US passport. And there's a direct correlation between a lot of the rhetoric and the anti-immigrant sentiment on both sides of the border, being on the northern border.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. So this is one of the organizations we visited that provides direct service to migrants and those individuals seeking asylum. So the name of them are Espacio Migrante, or Migrant Pace is how you could translate it. The woman that leads it is the one kneeling down with a flowery shirt. I'm forgetting her name right now, but she's the one that founded it on a complete, she started off with as a volunteer, mainly just seeing the need. And a good number of the individuals that they serve are African as well as Haitian. So they provided programming as well as other services specifically targeted to that. And we were very fortunate to be able to, so on the first floor, which is over here on the right side of the picture that we're having a conversation with the staff, and including one of their attorneys, that's where a lot of the community services and work happen. And then on the second floor, they actually have a shelter. And we actually were able to see some of the families, including children and babies that were up there. They had just been able to build a few bathrooms, showers, etc., with some of the donations. I can tell you that for those of you that express interest in getting involved, definitely this is one of the organizations to donate or something, because they're doing great work with very, very little money. And because of the work that they're doing, I actually, since our trip, follow them on Facebook, and I'll share that information with you in a second. And they constantly get attacked, even by Mexican officials, for the work that they're doing. Keep in mind that I just mentioned who they serve: African refugees or African seeking asylum and Haitians. There is a lot of racism within the Mexican community. So unfortunately, because of their skin color, even within Mexico, they're not always accepted. There is an effort within Mexico to try to create a process for some of these individuals to obtain either a student visa or work visa. So some of the individuals, some of the Haitians that we spoke with ended up choosing to stay in Mexico just because of how difficult it was to be able to seek asylum. And some of them are either learning Spanish or are trying to work or something within Mexico while they wait for their asylum application to be processed. But that's not always a path for everybody. That's the information, both the website and the Facebook. Again, I highly encourage you to visit them. They're doing really great work down there. This is another place we visited called Instituto Madre Asunta. They are Catholic-based. Their mission is specific all around Catholicism. On the left-hand side, you'll see some of the beds. They're all temporary shelters for individuals seeking asylum. They're migrants. And then over here on the right-hand, that's just a group with the woman holding the baby is actually the director of that center. They've been around for a really long time. This specific shelter is specifically for women and children. They also have another shelter just 2 doors down for men. So just because sometimes one, for those that are traveling alone, or for those because of just trying to make sure that everybody is safe, they do separate them. But depending if there are families traveling together, so husband and wife and children, then they do try to figure out alternatives. But they're also doing really, really amazing work. And within this shelter, they also have a kitchen. They're trying to fundraise to build a school. Again, because some of these families are being stuck per se in Mexico for a long time, sometimes these children are actually not allowed to enroll in school in Mexico. So they're trying to look into alternatives, but they're still trying to fundraise for the school, at least for those few months that the children are waiting. to be able to see whether or not their application gets accepted, be able to not lose out in education. Yes?
I understand our side of the border, there are a number, like I know Catholic Charities, Jewish Charities, they do these shelters, and the government just pushes people to them, and because the government doesn't have enough detention centers, pushes people to these shelters. Am I understanding that right?
To an extent, yes. So there's different things.
What's the question?
Oh yes, the question is that in the U.S. there's Catholic Charities and there's other organizations that serve as detention centers, and that is correct. I will say, not to confuse it, some of those organizations are refugee resettlement organizations, and that's completely different. They receive federal funding and then there's a whole other process for individuals that are seeking that are refugees. Yes, there are some organizations here within Illinois. You have Heartland Alliance, which is a big umbrella. And then you have some detention centers for children as well as for families. I don't know if Catholic Charities still has it, because there's been a lot of issues within some of these detention centers that because the funding they receive from the federal government per person is not always enough, whatever that may mean. Some of the regulations and some of the policies internally, they have found that some of these individuals are not living in good standards. So there has been some issues within some of the detention centers, but yet you're right. Most states, depending on how many detention centers they have, that's where individuals are being sent to. There are a lot more across the southern border, but yes, Illinois has some, California, Michigan, and a few others. But these are different because these are for individuals that are on the other side of the border. Yes, sir?
Can you talk a little bit about sanctuary cities?
Sure. What exactly do you want me to talk about? What it means?
Why we have them and why they're good, what the pros and cons are.
Sure. So the question was if I could talk a little bit about sanctuary cities. On a personal level, I don't agree with them, mainly because with this administration, there's no such thing as sanctuary. Prior to this administration, sanctuary cities or sanctuary states mainly meant that individuals, whether it be immigrants as a whole or undocumented, would not be turned over to immigration, that there would be no communication between immigration and the police, etc. Chicago, I can't think of out here in Lake County, but I know Chicago, Oak Park, River Forest, and a few other suburbs have passed ordinances that say welcoming for all that are sanctuary. And it's mainly when there is that agreement between the local mayor or the village president not to allow the police to turn over somebody to immigration. But it gets defined very broadly, so that's the other issue with it.
Aren't they, if you're only violation of the law is that you're here without the proper documentation, the local government is not going to turn you over to immigration to be deported. Whereas if you've committed it, so that if you're a victim of a crime, you're not going to be afraid to go to the police and be a witness.
That's somewhat of it. So the statement was that these sanctuary policies are for individuals that are undocumented and for them to not to be afraid to go to the police, etc. That's some of it, sir. One of the issues with sanctuary policies is they get defined and they get implemented very differently. There's really no standard for them, and they're always up to interpretation and depending on the politics of the local government. So technically, yes, it's supposed to be so everyone feels welcome, but I could tell you that one of the issues we have in Chicago, this new mayor seems to be wanting to do some things, but the prior mayor, without anybody knowing, had allowed the Chicago Police Department to have a database to capture a bunch of different data, and a good number of that information in that database included people that were undocumented, that had never committed a crime, but yet they were on that database. So, and technically Chicago is a sanctuary city. So that's one of the issues, that depending on how stuff gets defined and implemented, it's good on paper, but how it gets implemented sometimes, unfortunately, is not always standardized. So there's some information about Madre Asunta. And then another place that we visited was another migrant shelter that has been around for a really long time. This is the one that's specifically for men. So it's right next to Madre Asunta. The person that oversees it, is she here? No, she's not in this picture. She's actually talking over here in the corner to us. It's about 3 different levels where they have small apartments. They all share, you find anywhere between 3 to 5 individuals per room. They do have a schedule for them. So they need to wake up at a certain time. They need to leave the shelter at a certain time, either to go and learn, so either enroll in school or go look for a job, and then they're allowed back into the shelter at a certain time. They are fed with donations. So on the right-hand side, the 3 ladies with the aprons are some of the volunteers that cook for the individuals on a daily basis. They have an awesome kitchen as well as food pantry from different donations they receive from either the community or from cities or states across. So there's another great place that's doing really good work. And again, they pretty much are in partnership with Madre Asunta, except this one specifically for men. Those are just some pictures that capture, on the left-hand side, I know there's a little bit of, that was my bad of not taking a good picture. You have, it says, the caption says, services that are offered at that organization, Casa Migrante. So anything from health services, to spiritual guidance, to being able to save, to computer skills, social work, human rights, getting clothes based on donations, haircuts, and they also serve as a place to receive money for individuals from their relatives. So if a person that's seeking, that's waiting to get asylum has a relative in the US, and that relative is able to send money to that individual through this organization. Yes, sir?
I just have a question about words. Why do you suppose some of these organizations use words like migrante or immigrante instead of refugio, for example?
Good question. I'm not too sure why they choose migrant. Oh, sorry. The question is why some of these organizations choose to use migrant versus refugee. I'm not sure. I could tell you my personal assumption might be because for somebody that's trying to seek refugee status, it's a really long process. It's about like 1.5 years, 2 years. And when somebody's seeking refugee, the little that I know of this is it has to be something that's already kind of been approved by the US government as certain countries that you're able to claim political persecution from. So that's one of the differences. But I don't know if it's just the mission or maybe depending on when these organizations were created, if maybe they were seeing more migrants and refugees. So I wouldn't know. Oh, and then on the other hand side, on the right side, those are actually letters of individuals that have crossed, have either stayed temporarily at the shelter and have left behind for future migrants. So that's some information about the website and the Facebook page. And then another part, this one was, I don't know if some of you have heard about it. I personally hadn't heard that much about it. We came across a number of individuals that represent veterans that have been deported. It was surprising to an extent because I hadn't really heard a lot of these stories, and we actually were able to speak with 2 of the veterans that had been deported. The individual you see in the picture, he's actually just a volunteer, and he's just interested in the cause because one of his sons is a veteran. The organization's Veterans for Peace works to raise awareness around this issue and try to see what could be changed. Without going into the whole, you could say, topic, one of the things that has been happening is after 1996 laws, on the one hand, a lot of people know about these laws because they're what restricted individuals being able to receive health and human services based on their immigration status and their income. But one of the other things that law did was it also criminalized certain things. So even if you have a green card, depending what kind of crime you commit, let's say 1 DUI, 2 DUIs, let's say you do something around domestic violence. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but sometimes depending on what kind of crime you commit, then immigration has the authority to deport you. Even if you have a green card, and even if you served in the army. So those are some of the cases that we came across. Individuals that were legal permanent residents, they didn't know about the process of becoming a citizen, and then all of a sudden something happened. Again, it could have been a DUI, it could have been 2 DUIs, it could be, I just gave you 2 examples. I don't know the list of crimes, but they could have done something like that and they get deported. And once you get deported, it's pretty much impossible for you to be able to come back to the US. Yes, sir?
The question I'd like to ask is there any major world organizations that you integrate with at all or cooperate with? As an example would be, the first one that would strike me would be, there's nothing in terms of international world, is the Gates Foundation. Do you interact at all with the Gates Foundation?
We as ICIRR do not. To my knowledge, we always are welcome to suggestions and partnerships, but not to my knowledge, sir.
The reason I mention that is that you may be young enough, but today in this world, and our laws are Anglo-Saxon. As an example, the two largest beneficiaries of our country are Egypt and Israel in terms of monies that we receive. And so consequently, if you think back on this, what is happening on our borders today is after World War II, we had a plan called the Marshall Plan. That Marshall Plan allowed Europe to survive. Without the Marshall Plan, you'd have the same problems you have today at the border.
Correct.
So in terms of what we have today, until we have a government, and I'm talking in terms of, say, these 15, 20 Democrats, first thing I'd say, I would hire you to be my consultant in terms of what's happening immediately. I don't think any of them have any consequence, have any idea whatsoever in terms of the litany that you have, the intelligence you have. Until someone steps up to the table and understands, and I don't know if you will, but you participate in the Organization of American States at all?
I don't think so. I mean, we as a statewide coalition, we mainly focus on Illinois. We do have partnerships across the U.S., and we do participate with some national organizations, but not international.
Until our country understands who's ever in politics today, until we develop a Marshall Plan for Americans. I mean, I don't know who knows about Honduras. And until we do that, all these people you interact on a daily basis with, they're their pawns, as you understand. And so we have a commitment from whoever our government may be. And so we develop a Marshall Plan. We will no longer ever be able to do the things that you want to do. And keep in mind, our 2 greatest imports are Canada and Mexico in this country.
Yeah.
It's not China.
Yeah.
But what percent of American companies are importing their wares from outside our country?
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. I definitely agree. So I think I have just a few more slides. I know it's getting a little warm in here, and I want to make sure we have time for other questions. Here, I took a picture of this. This actually has the names. I'm trying to remember if it. Oh, this has the names. These are all the veterans that have been deported that they know of. So you'll see that it's a long list. And this is just the name of the individuals that they know of.
Is it on the U.S. side or the Mexican?
There's let me remember, the U.S. side. Sorry, no, the Mexico side. I don't know why I said the U.S. Mexico side, because they're not able to go. The Mexico side. That one, this was a little bit of a controversial painting, I was told. You'll see that the U.S. flag is upside down. This was painted by volunteers, both that they have a garden along this wall, and also by volunteers from the Veterans Organization. They were trying to get pushed to repaint it, but what the person told us from that organization, Veterans for Peace, I believe, I just blanked out on the name of the organization, you'll see that the stop sign says lies. The reason why they decided to do the flag that way is not to disrespect the flag, but mainly just to show the hypocrisy within the government of how they served the country, and then once they served, they didn't choose to help them or advocate. I'm just explaining what it is. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, by the way.
Well, isn't it also the simple distress?
Yes.
Flag upside down.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Yes. So to wrap up, Some of the next steps that we decided on after our visit was to be doing presentations like the one today, as well as some community meetings to really facilitate conversation across communities, and more specifically, just to raise awareness around these issues. One of the things that we would always ask both the shelters and the organizations we visited was, what is one thing that we could do? Surprisingly, hardly any of them would say fundraising or donating. They would always say, please raise awareness and please make sure that your elected officials know what is actually happening here versus what's being said in the media. Then once you engage in the conversation, then they would say, and please let them know what the work we're doing to get donations. So I would just encourage you as well, either one or two things that you learned today to also share it with others. And for those of you that are involved with your elected officials, to also educate and inform them, because it's really important that we all raise awareness around this.